This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's November the 15th. And we're going to talk a little bit about Allerton. But we're doing that in the context of talking about projects and successful projects, but also not successful projects. So I want to introduce one such or a couple of such projects. It doesn't mean you actually lose out. The attempts, the losses turn up in a different way somewhere else, some other time. Sometimes they're completely washed out, but you have to have the confidence to try and see how it works. It's like playing music. Some new event might not work. On the other hand, it might take off and go virus. So Allerton Park is 150 acres. It's actually more than that because there's a number of farmlands that are surround Allerton Park that help to maintain it. It is a little bit rolling because it's got some elements of the Sarasota Moraine. It has a river, the Sangamon River, that runs through it. It has a lot of bottomland forest and some upland forest. It has a rookery, and it has levees, and it's an interesting place to visit. There's a north side and a south side. There's access from the expressway by a north entrance, and there's an access through Monticello on Allerton Road that comes in over a bridge over the Sangamon. So many of you have been there, so I don't need to elaborate. There was a radio antenna there, and we had been photographing the trails on the conservation side, and it seemed to us that the radio antenna had been retired. It was one with feet coming splayed out. The more modern one is one that sits on a pin and has guy wires. So the radio station had upgraded to a pinpoint aerial, or actually several, and this was obsolete. There was a radio broadcast house underneath for engineers who had to control the output, and it was a neat little house, and it was not occupied. So we asked if we could use it as a visitor center and set it up in that way. We talked with the administrator of Allerton Park, and he thought that was a good idea. And we had meetings there and took field trips from that site. But it was considered by some elements of the university that this was a liability. So there was, in the wings, there was the concept of removing the antenna, which is probably at least 150 feet high. I had taken a Bell and Howell camera, 16 millimeter camera, and climbed up the tower, and that's sort of where the liability comes in sometimes. But the advantage of the tower was that you could, in the fall, you could see the bottomlands and the uplands. You could see over the extent of Allerton Park. These days, you can do that with a what would you call it? As a Zoom type device from uh, and I'm forgetting the name of the device that can stand above and take photographs. Uh, Eventually, it was decided to remove the antenna, and I was disappointed about that because I was hoping to put floors at various stages on the tower and create a, a visual stand, a stand that you could use to an observation stand. Uh, but the pedestals were bombed and the tower fell down. And just by happenstance, two people came along and they had put the tower up. And they did it as a part of their honeymoon. And the guy explained that they keep these towers in the West to keep watch on fires. And he thought the same sort of thing that I was thinking could happen here. So the tower was down, the building was down, the site was still there, and the site has a well, and you could park a trailer house there, and you could have a visitor center on the south side of the Allerton Park. The north side where the house is has developed some sort of a visitor center there, and probably this will never be a visitor center, but some of the work that we did to create that site and to use it has possibly promoted other people to think about what they might do too. So it's not a dead loss. It's something that contributed in the long run. It was near to a forest, and the forest was creeping into a prairie that was planted on a farmland. And it was behind a preview house that these days has a barn that is used for concerts. A different concept. And the forest is gradually encroaching on the prairie. If you burn it, the forest will retreat. But there's been quite a lot of research done to see how the trees are invading and how the creatures are invading. We would burn the prairie occasionally, and there would be rattlesnakes that would emerge, probably a little injured, but the overall benefit of burning it is greater than the loss of a few creatures, because they will do better after burn. There were nice little trails around that are still used, and there was a rookery and levees. Levees are where the river has flatland, and you put a levee around the flatland and pump the water out that comes in from the surrounding slopes and put in a patch of corn or soybeans. It doesn't happen anymore because the equipment has gotten to be too big to do that sort of thing, and it's too small. So it reverts to natural area. At the south side of Allerton Park, there was a Hogshoe Bridge. And Hogshoe Bridge was a steel bridge, a truss bridge. And we dearly wanted to save it as a bridge. It was going to be replaced by a concrete bridge because these old bridges can't manage a harvest equipment or planting equipment, which is huge. So thus, the concrete bridge with no truss over the top and wide enough to take large equipment. It didn't quite happen. The new bridge was going in, and the cranes that worked the bridge and the various pieces of equipment were still there. And over Christmas, when it was still fine, the old bridge was taken out. It may have been thought again that there would be some liability, but I think the fun would be in having that bridge. Unfortunately, it had been recently repaired, so all the planking was relatively new, so it had advantages for salvage, and I think that's one of the reasons why it came out. It's on an embankment which has some of the elements of the Cerro Gordo moraine, and it's a still water, fairly deep, and it's a place where you can canoe. So this was a place where we had hoped to put in a canoe and go down to Decatur. The property on top used to be, on top of the hill, used to be a country club. And there are all sorts of stories about what went on at the country club. It might start with cards and get to be an interesting place to be. It is now a home and well used. But once again, the thought was there, and as you have people come to visit, come to help prepare, you're talking to each other, and there are sites nearby now that are burned by the Department of Natural Resources and others. And there's a country road that runs around the back part of Allerton Park that uses the concrete bridge, and you get access to the Lost Garden and other parts of Allerton Park. Let me see if I can give you an idea of Allerton Park. I have a map here, and I'm on Zoom, so we have to photograph it from the camera. And I think I can get away a little bit. Yes, now you get an idea of a large natural area. And I'll turn it around, and there's a housing place. And that's where there's a house that has interest, but it is not big enough for big events. So there's a thought process in order to enlarge that facility. It's often visited. There is an open space near to the house, near to a lake, an artificial lake, but it allows people to wander and to game and to see the forest in the distance. It's not as if you're you couldn't see the forest for the trees. But you can do that too. You can walk down and around by the Sangamon and uh, have stations. Uh, so we had a couple of landscape architecture grad students who, well, perhaps they were undergraduates, but they created a trail, and that mightn't have been the most sophisticated trail, but it was certainly an aid to people finding their way around and finding interesting resources. So once again, uh, you you have a facility that is bigger than any one person, uh, bigger than a community, and it has all sorts of debates about it, very interdisciplinary, uh, very municipal. At one stage, the entrance from the Monticello Allerton Road, uh, there was a bridge out. And so there was a lot of debate about uh, replacing the bridge, an expensive job, and stabilizing a road from the bridge to the other entrance of Allerton Park, the house entrance side. Uh, when you go across a bottomland, it is very swampy. Then the ballast that you put in is often sinking in various ways. So if you were to imagine driving from the bridge to an upland part of the park, you would feel yourself uh, jumping here and there. The Australians have a name for it. It's called the Kangaroo Road. And if you're carting a lot of grain, it might be a place where you lose your load because of the bumpiness. Well, that had to be stabilized, but that meant there had to be a lot of meetings at Monticello and within the university and in the community to see that that happened. Uh, around the main property, there are farms that are leased out for agriculture, and they support Allerton Park. At one location, Sam Allerton, who bought the area in with Civil War money because he was providing food for the Union troops, uh, he bought the land and put in a, a farmstead next to the railroad that we happen to now own as Heartland Pathways. He had various farmhouses around and a barn and a shed that housed equipment like buggies or mowers or seeding equipment. For us, this was a unique place where you could explain agriculture, and often students especially will come to the university and not really realize the details of agriculture. So we thought that that might also be an interpretive center, and we wrote letters to that effect, and that didn't happen either. And in fact, the wooden elevator, which we regarded as an icon of the uh, region, was also burned down. And so when you have a resource, you have to maintain it and make sure that it doesn't accidentally disappear. We have that problem all the time because over the years we've been working with 60 miles of railroad bed, and they're all very vulnerable to uh, being dug up for corn or soybean or for other uses. A little bit of invasion here and there. So even when the trail has not been developed, and it often might be developed after many years, then there needs to be someone to say, "Excuse me, but could you park your car somewhere else? This is not a sale yard for cars. Uh, it's a natural area, and it's conservation is a form of land use, and we would prefer that you don't make it of a parking lot." So you have to be diplomatic to say some of those things. Sometimes you even have to get more dramatic and even go to court if necessary, but you try to avoid that at all possibilities. Mainly, you try to reason. Talking is a wonderful experience. Uh, it's where you uh, begin to find out what each other's objectives are. And sometimes they're very simple. At one site, we would have mounds of uh, fertilizer placed right upon the prairie because that was the easiest and obvious place. And for some people, it's a wasted area that uh, could be should have fertilizer dumped on it. So then you have to explain that this is unique soil, unique plants, and we would prefer you didn't do that and make a little road that in order to pick it up and spread that material later on. Uh, there are things like road cuts where you really would prefer not to have a road cut if you're going to have animals move along this connective corridor, move towards a river, for instance, then you need continuity, and road cuts don't help it. If you go to the Nature Preserves Commission, you will encounter people who are very familiar for requests for uh, road cuts from a subdevelopment uh, that they don't really want. There are roads that have had trees that cover over them, and it's quite an experience to drive along Allerton Road in one place near Willow Branch and experience that uh, shadiness, tall shadiness, and it encourages different species. Well, then roadside management people have a different opinion. They want to have the road dry so it doesn't get wet and doesn't get boggy, and uh, you don't destroy the asphalt. So one day you come around and all the trees on the side of the road have been removed, and it's so barren. And so there you have another debate. Can you can you do this? Uh, in amongst the bushes in a location uh, that is somewhat vulnerable, there were all sorts of interesting places to sit, sculpted places, sculpted pieces. And gradually, when this park was donated by not Sam Allerton, but his son uh, to the university, then it was more accessible, and some of these items got destroyed. So, uh, but in time, they might go back. Some of them were moved to safer situations. All of that involves money. But you sometimes, especially with the elevator, you'd lose a tear a bit and go on. Near to the elevator, we have 4 miles of uh, prairie. It's not the world's greatest prairie, folks. It's the only prairie we have left. So in many of these communities, the railroad remnant prairie is all we have. So can you develop a trail on that prairie? Well, yes, uh, you can, but it if it's given too much traffic, then that's not going uh, to work because the trail will get wider and wider, and the prairie will get less and less. And there's some people who'll stand around and say, "Well, I didn't take out the last little bit. Why are we being penalized for this last little bit? We deserve to have our opportunity to be at it too." And then you have to explain that when you're down to so little that there's almost no prairie left, then you need that site. Uh, I'm going to look at my notes because I have a number of different things here. Uh, oh, on that prairie, Allen Park has eastern Massasoit rattlers, and they're endangered species, but they're on the south side conservation side. But somebody found one that had been run over by a tractor on our railroad bed, so we had to uh, go to the uh, Natural Areas Commission and ask that corridor be preserved for the dignity of the snakes. Another debate because there's a competition between the recreators uh, versus the preservators. The preservation people look like a bunch of weeds, an area that's not being used for economic development, and so uh, usually the recreation has credence over the preservation. And so once again, you have to stand around and you have to note that often that territory is mown. So where is the seat of the mowing power? Well, we have an easement for electricity, and we don't like to have trees. The power companies don't like to have trees that's short to the wires and cause fires. And that's okay, but it can sometimes be uh, very challenging because it takes out the prairie too. Uh, if if there's trees, invasive trees that have in, uh, found their way onto the right of way, we don't really want the trees. But there were not too many trees in the prairie. It was usually fairly swampy, and the main tree that survived fairly well is cottonwood that uh, has deep roots and can reach into aquifers, and it's fairly drought resistant. Uh, so nearby, we have a 30-acre sports zone, which has been recreated because Monticello didn't have a place where uh, young folk could get together and do sporting things in one place. They had little pieces here on parks or in recreation sites in various places. So that means there's going to be traffic right near our railroad and right near our railroad prairie. So once again, there will be a need for discussion. So we need leaders and we need CEOs to help to maintain these debates, to maintain them at a level where you're not necessarily shouting at each other. Uh, the and it takes a certain amount of talent to do that. But don't be afraid if you don't feel you have that sort of talent. You can do things which helps us. There's signs. There's uh, uh, salvage of equipment that's been left on the railroad. There's bridge repairs. There's signs to keep uh, to make people aware of their presence, and that takes a deal of organization and people who have that specialty uh, to be applauded. They know how to talk to each other. They also know how to listen. And in that 4 miles between Monticello and Cisco is Allerton Park. And when the rattlesnake was found there, the university was approached asked to give a mile by 66 feet uh, for the restoration of prairie on a cornfield. So that meant that the university lost some income, but the objective was to create an artificial prairie which would encourage the rattlers if they were around. And people walk that corridor fairly regularly. They were looking for this endangered species, and they would carry a little stick with a forky end, and you would, if you found a snake, you could put that forky end over the rear of the head and feel safe. Uh, and then you could identify the snake. People are not very uh, fond of snakes, so you have to be careful how you use them and how you introduce people. Uh, Sometimes you can, with diplomacy, ask the mowing people if they mow trees and leave a lot of uh, wood, then that wood takes a long time to decay, and it takes the energy of the organisms that are doing that away from your soils and prairie preservation. Just this week, I got a letter from someone in the South that's asked, was it sensible to uh, mulch around uh, prairie sites? And my answer was no, especially if the mulch is large and takes a long time to decay. Uh, Compost would be better. Uh, so, oh, this is a neat one. The University of Illinois has had a 4-H place for years, and it got to be very popular with a certain group of people. And the adults and children would come very regularly each year and meet with each other. It was like a family reunion. Uh, but it was felt that it wasn't necessarily uh, servicing a broad bunch of people And so it was. Uh, it's still there, and it still is a camp, but it's a little different than what it was. But some people who came to that camp as young people or as older people uh, come back. And one family that I'm very familiar with came back to that area, built a new house on a 5 acre plot, and grew a prairie just like the prairie that was near to where he was experiencing at Allerton Park. And so you have that sort of excitement. Uh, oh, uh, I'm looking at my time and I'm looking at my notes. Because uh, we're being asked if we want to put a 5 inch pipe for gas down that 4 mile. And on the balance, that might be okay. So that's one of those things where you have to figure, uh, does this have to be maintained? Do you have to bring in a huge piece of equipment? And in other places, yes, the answer is you might have to uh, quell a leak or uh, inspect the pipe. And you have what is called a construction easement, and the construction easement can be mown uh, like it in the fall of the year when the plants are dormant, and then you can put over a construction pallet on top of that. And if you have to bring in heavy equipment, then it can stand on that construction pallet and then be uh, when the operation is finished, uh, the construction easement can be removed, and the prairie comes back reasonably so. Uh, this week I've been talking to people who hunt, and most hunters are rather respectful of uh, ownership of property. Uh, and it's very kind of them to call up and ask if they could hunt on your bed. Uh, it is, in some cases, it is bow and arrow hunting. In some cases, it's uh, rifle hunting. In some cases, there are just too many deer and they get to starve and they get to have disease. And the Department of Natural Resources or other agencies like the Grand Prairie Friends will bring in uh, huntsmen that are used to culling the deer population. They're they ravenous, and they'll eat most everything that's ideal. If you have uh, understory herbs, and you see Shady Rest behind White Heath is a typical example. It's uh, got a little bit of bottomland uh, area adjacent to the Sangamon River. It has some upland forest, and it has some of the Cerigordo moraine. It was a 30-acre plot next to a railroad line. The railroad line actually runs through and cuts the area in half. It was an area that was platted for uh, a village, and it was felt that uh, this might be a small town, and it didn't happen. I can remember one in Missouri, which was called Defiance, and they actually did get it. And it depends on who's looking for what, and perhaps the value of the area for other purposes. This is in a forested area, so uh, you have to know that not a lot of people go there. It's uh, it's owned by the Piatt County Forest Preserve, and they put in trails. They have a tax base, and can do that. They can have apply for grants, and uh, so especially when it's dry and it's flood time, it's not so. Some of the trail is covered, but otherwise, it opens up the area a little bit, so people get to see uh, native plants, and so it's the state is designated through the uh, Nature Preserves Commission. It's designated as a soil and water conservation easement. Uh, uh, but we don't usually encourage hunting because the area is open. It's not a trail, but in some places it's quite walkable and not rideable. And someday we would hope to have it rideable. But you have to know that there will be other people, and some people, especially people from overseas, might not know that there's a hunting season. So I've had occasion to have a check up on people who are walking in a hunting season when uh, they don't have zoop suits on, the orange suits that would alert hunters to uh, who and what they are. Uh, so we have these sorts of conversations from time to time. It's a very, very narrow corridor. It's only 100 feet wide, so it's it means that if a hunter shoots a deer, the deer will run off injured into the adjacent territory. And some owners do not like that because actually they rent out the adjacent area for hunters and charge for that. And this is a violation of their relationship to other hunters. Uh, so then you get into a battle, a court battle. Who owns the deer and who's responsible for walking on somebody else's property? It's uh, again a a debate. Sometimes it's working with media. We had a railroad bed coming through from uh, Leroy to uh, Dewey Fisher to Rantoul to Dillsburg to Lafayette, Indiana. And at the early time of that closeout, we were aware that there was very little prairie left and there was prairie on this corridor. So we took photographs of that prairie. We had a big old blunderbuss uh, camera that was about 2 feet long, might even be more than that you could hardly carry on your shoulder. And we took lots of footage of videotape. Uh, we would carry a tripod, which was very heavy, but it would keep the camera still. And uh, so then that videotape had to be uh, edited. And what used to be an IGA store near to Urbana High School, it was a video center. I think it was there because uh, the city had demanded that Time Warner, if it was going to do things with video broadcasting, then they had to have a center for the public to do public editing and information exchange. And indeed, the Banner public television exists partially because of that, because there was this feeling that the world was growing into a visual event where visuals were very helpful, and that there should be a visual corridor uh, or a visual organization that could not only record city council meetings, uh, but also uh, to record interesting items that might range from a royal historic house to uh, a bumblebee on a flower like bee balm. And uh, so one of my problems there was that we spent 60 hours uh, editing about 6 rolls of videotape. And the videotape was provided by the visual center. So we left it there in a location to work on it periodically. And someone came along and had a need for videotape, and they utilized those tapes. And that burned up so much time. So once again, you are learning next time, even if you don't own the tape, you take the tape with you and preserve it. And so each one of these things you try to do, you have to have a sense of humor, and you have to learn from that experience and go on to the next. And you, you, you have to be fairly positive about it. Every once in a while, you can uh, have uh, good order to be uh, so right that you are right. But often there's a compromise. I'm not a big compromiser when there's nothing left. So that can be another matter for discussion. And we've had one of those sorts of discussions on the 4 miles between Monticello and Armenia and Cisco. Uh, do we develop little pieces that look good, or do we look at the whole 33 miles of railroad bed? So there's 1 mile which was developed with a trail on our railroad bed over a truss bridge, which we bought with the objective of doing trails as well as re-railing if necessary, or for biology. And so that was extended by a mile, but a road cut was put across it, and there's lots of debate about this. At the Clinton end, we had the opportunity to join 2 state parks, Clinton Reservoir and Weldon Springs State Park, with a railroad bed. And once again, you're in a learning mode. You don't know how much the land is worth. You don't know how much the state is prepared to pay for it. But there's also that the state is prepared to put some claim on it, some reason for it existing. It's much harder to challenge a state organization than it is to challenge a community group or an individual. So you may be paid little, but you may be rewarded in protection. So Uh, we had some debate about that at the state level and at the local level. And at that time, uh, we didn't go ahead of it because we thought that the offer for the work that we done to buy the bed was half the value what we thought it was worth. And I think uh, later, when knowing more, we would probably have been prepared to accept a lower price and realizing that the state could be very helpful. Uh, we have the chance at the moment to buy a plot of land next to our railroad bed prairie and gravel pit prairie at Rantoul. And so we have to think very seriously about whether we buy it, whether we have the talent to uh, maintain it. It has an old road running through it, which we think is an antique road. We would hate to see it dug up and replaced by a new road. This was a highway in its day, concreted and 2-lane road. And the purchase of that one plot of land uh, would mean that the more remnant or more original prairie could be allowed to grow without a lot of traffic, and a reconstruction prairie is can be trailed and can be have a visitor center and a workplace, and it can be uh, uh, a key is the name, a key to 10 miles of railbed that goes to Paxton. So we're wondering if that will happen. It's mostly owned by the Department of Transportation, but adjacent is a an interurban railbird that's been retired. So the question then is, who owns the interurban bed? Uh, has uh, that means you have to go to the county and find the titles and the deeds and the owners, and uh, that may be a 15-year job. It may be that the owners have moved back to Europe and left this, but somebody pays the taxes. Who's paying the taxes? And so we have to, in order to encourage the Department of Transportation to think about activating that road as a prairie uh, walkway or bicycle way with easements off for traffic. It's Route 45 and it's wide. It used to be a highway. So you got an old Route 45, which you're making into a trail, and another Route 45, which is nearby and more recent, uh, and it's wide, and that road in turn has been replaced by a 57, which takes most of the traffic. So here you have a modestly trafficked uh, corridor, and you can take uh, cars off it without uh, safety being challenged, and you can have kiosks and perhaps even a picnic table here and there, and introduce people to uh, their own heritage prairie. I mean, most of the local population doesn't know uh, too much about their own prairie. If you ask them to uh, annotate 50 species of prairie plants, they probably couldn't do it. And visitors are always anxious to come and look to see uh, what you are doing in your community, what makes you famous. Uh, if it's a dead community, why did it die? Uh, are the ruins historic, and that sort of thing. We've come to the end of our 55 minutes. I like to uh, leave room for WEFT to promote uh, its rather wonderful radio waves. We add, with the help of Urbana Public Television, pictures, and we're starting to do some programs that are not necessarily aired on the radio, but are special uh, pictorial programs. We're doing one on the Big Dig or detention pond on 2nd Street, and we have had so much help doing all those things that I am amazed sometimes. It's not easy work to do, but it's rather wonderful work to do. And when you see things happening that are positive, and you see that plant growing, and you see that bee, then you applaud the people who have helped to give you supporting assistantships and managerial jobs and bought artwork and made this sort of thing possible. Thank you. And this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.